He left her in the snow to die. Not because he had to, because it was easier than admitting she knew too much, loved too hard, and trusted the wrong man with everything she had. Vincent Moretti, king of Chicago's underworld, feared by enemies, worshipped by soldiers, made the coldest decision of his life on the coldest night of the year. He drove away and never looked back. He told himself she wouldn't survive. He told himself it was necessary. He was wrong on both counts. This is the story of the woman he buried in a snowstorm and how she came back to bury him. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every part of this matters. The road north of the city had no name on most maps. It was the kind of road that existed because men like Vincent Moretti needed places where things could disappear. Debts, evidence, people. It cut through a corridor of dense pine forest that turned black and featureless past 10 at night, and in the deep weeks of January, when the temperature dropped past zero and the wind came off Lake Michigan like something with teeth, that road became something close to the edge of the world. Elena Voss had been on that road before. She knew what it meant when Vincent drove without speaking, one hand on the wheel, the other resting against his thigh with the particular stillness of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for the geography to catch up with it. She had seen that posture before, at the table before he ordered something done, in the hallway before a conversation that ended someone's position in the organization. She had learned to read it the way you learn to read weather. It had just never been pointed at her. The SUV was warm. Outside, the first real snow of the season had been falling for 3 hours, and the road ahead showed no tire tracks from anyone else stupid enough to be out here. The heater hummed. The radio was off. Vincent hadn't spoken since they left the house on Waveland, where 40 minutes earlier 2 men Elena had never seen before had knocked on the back door and spent 11 minutes speaking to Vincent in the kitchen with the door closed. She had sat in the living room and listened to the muffled rhythm of the conversation. Vincent's voice low and flat, the other voices clipped and urgent, and felt the cold move through the room even though the thermostat read 72. When he came out, his face was the composed, emptied-out face he wore when something had shifted and he didn't want her to know it yet. He'd picked up his coat from the hook by the door and said, "Get your things. We're going to the lake house tonight." The lake house was where they went when Vincent needed space to think, or when something in the city had gotten loud enough that distance was prudent. She had no reason to question it. She got her coat, her bag, the book she'd been reading. She followed him out to the SUV without asking, because in 5 years of marriage, she had learned that questions asked in that particular silence came back to her in ways that took days to recover from. Now they were 40 minutes north, on a road that should have been 40 minutes from the lake house, and she was doing math in her head that she didn't want to do. "Vincent." Her voice was level. She had trained it to be. "This isn't the way to the lake house." He didn't answer. The turn was 6 miles back. "I know where the turn is." "Then why, Elena?" The way he said her name was a door closing. Not loud, just final. She looked out the window. The trees were close on both sides, the headlights carving a narrow channel through the dark, and the snow was coming down harder now, the flakes large and slow and deliberate looking. Beautiful, in the way things are beautiful when you're not afraid. She was afraid. "Tell me what those men said to you," she said. He exhaled through his nose. "Things I'm handling." "Are you?" The SUV slowed. Not gradually, not because of the road conditions. It slowed the way vehicles slow when the driver makes a decision to stop. He pulled off the road onto a narrow shoulder that wasn't really a shoulder, more a widening in the tree line, the kind of space that might exist by accident, or might exist because someone had cleared it for exactly this purpose. He put the vehicle in park. The engine kept running. The heater kept humming. Elena's hand moved to the door handle without her consciously deciding to move it. 34 years of living in the body of a woman who had grown up watching her father navigate dangerous men had taught her nervous system things her brain was still catching up to. "Don't," Vincent said, not threatening, just tired. "Vincent, look at me." He turned his head and looked at her, and what she saw in his face was the thing she had been afraid of since the kitchen door closed 40 minutes ago. It wasn't anger. Anger she could work with. It wasn't calculation. Calculation she could read. It was the particular blankness of a man who had run the numbers and arrived at a conclusion and was now operating on the other side of it, where emotion was no longer a relevant variable. Marco talked, he said. Marco Bianchi, the organization's financial architect. The man who had moved money through 17 shell companies across 4 states for the past 11 years. The man who knew where every dollar had come from, where it had gone, and who had touched it along the way. If Marco had talked, to whom, about what, under what circumstances, the consequences depended entirely on those details, but none of the possibilities were comfortable. To who? Elena asked. Doesn't matter to who. Matters what he said. What did he say? Vincent looked at her for a long moment. The heater blew warm air between them. Outside, the snow came down. He said you helped him structure the accounts, Vincent said. 6 years ago, before the Petrelli consolidation. He said the layering system, the offshore routing. That was your design. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds, which Elena counted because her mind needed something to do while her body processed what her ears had just delivered. She had helped Marco. That was true. She had been 28, 3 months into the marriage, desperate to demonstrate usefulness to a man who treated competence like currency. She had a finance degree from Northwestern and a mind that saw patterns in numbers the way other people saw patterns in faces. Marco had come to her with a problem and she had solved it. Vincent had known, at the time, or she had believed he knew. The memory of whether she had explicitly told him or simply allowed him to infer was a blurry thing. Blurry in the way memories become blurry when you realize their meaning has changed retroactively. Vincent, I knew you helped with some bookkeeping. I didn't know your name was on a structural decision that's now in a federal deposition. His voice was flat. Not angry. That was the wrong word. He was past anger. He was in the place past anger where decisions lived. Marco gave them a name. He gave them yours. Then we fix it. We get Ferrara on the phone. We find Marco. There's no fixing it. He said it quietly. There's containing it. She heard the word and understood it the way you understand a word when you've spent 5 years living adjacent to men for whom containing had a specific operational meaning. Her hand pressed against the door handle. What does containing it look like? She asked. She needed to hear him say it. She needed the words to exist in the air between them so she could be sure she wasn't constructing a nightmare out of ordinary shadows. Vincent turned and looked out through the windshield at the snow. If you're not in the city, he said, you're not a problem they can use. If you're not a problem they can use, I have room to deal with Marco, deal with the feds, rebuild the wall. He paused. You understand what I'm saying? I understand what you're saying, she said. I want to hear you say it clearly. He turned to look at her again. Get out of the car, Elena. It landed in her chest like something dropped from a height, not a blow, a weight. The specific crushing weight of a thing you knew was possible but had convinced yourself was not probable. You're leaving me here, she said. There's a town 12 miles east. You can walk it. You're strong. It's 0 degrees. You have your coat. Vincent. Her voice cracked on his name just at the end, just slightly, and she hated herself for it. There's a foot of snow on the ground. I have heeled boots. 12 miles in 0 degrees in dress boots in a snowstorm is not a walk. It's a death sentence. He didn't say anything. Is that what this is? She asked. Is that what containing it looks like? Vincent Moretti looked at his wife for what would be the last time in either of their lives as any version of the people they had been in that house on Waveland. His face held the composition of a man who has made an ugly decision and is committed to it. And underneath that, if you knew how to read him, and Elena knew how to read him better than anyone alive, there was the ghost of something else. Regret, maybe. Or the cousin of regret that visits people who know they are making an irreversible mistake, but have decided the alternative is worse. You're resourceful, he said. You always have been. He reached across and pushed the passenger door open from the inside. The cold came in like a physical thing, immediate and enormous, the wind carrying snow that hit her face and neck. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she stepped out of the vehicle. The door shut behind her. She heard the locks engage. She watched through the glass as Vincent shifted the SUV into drive, pulled back onto the road, and accelerated north, the taillights shrinking to 2 red points in the dark, then disappearing around a bend in the trees. Elena Voss stood on the side of a nameless road in the northern woods outside Chicago, in heeled boots and a winter coat, with a book in her bag and no phone. She had left it on the kitchen counter at the house on Waveland, the way you leave things when you believe you're coming back. And the temperature was falling, and the snow was thickening, and the only light in the world was the pewter gray smear that the cloud cover made against the darkness above the trees. She stood there for 45 seconds, which she counted, because her mind needed something to do. Then she started walking. She had grown up in Pilsen, in a house that kept the heat at 62, because her father believed that comfort made people soft. She had walked 2 miles to school every day until she was 14, because her father believed the bus was for people who didn't understand what legs were for. She had learned to read weather, to read men, to read rooms, and she had learned all of it in an environment that did not reward softness or complaint or the particular self-pity of people who believed the world owed them easier conditions. None of that made the cold less cold, but it meant that when her body registered the cold, the immediate seizing of exposed skin, the wind finding every gap in her coat's construction, the snow accumulating on her shoulders and in her hair, she did not spend energy on panic. Panic was a luxury that burned calories she needed for walking. She turned east on the road and walked. The heels were the immediate problem. They weren't stilettos, practical 2-inch block heels on leather boots that reached her knee, the kind of boots that were reasonable for a dinner out or a meeting in the city, which was what she had expected this evening to involve. On clear pavement, they were manageable. On a snow-covered road in the dark, each step required active negotiation between her foot, the boot's sole, and the packed and shifting surface underneath. She fell twice in the first quarter mile. The first time she caught herself on both hands, the cold of the snow immediate and shocking through her gloves, and she got up and kept going. The second time she went down harder, knee first, and she stayed down for a moment, not from pain, though there was pain, but because she needed to make a calculation. She needed to assess what resources she had and what her actual situation was. Bone, none. The Waveland house was 40 miles south, minimum. The lake house was 6 miles west and locked, and even if she reached it, she had no key. The road she was on appeared to be a logging or maintenance access road, minimal traffic, particularly in winter, particularly at this hour. Her coat was a good wool coat, a Burberry she'd bought the previous winter, lined, long, covering her to the thigh. Her gloves were cashmere-lined leather. Inadequate for sustained exposure, but not nothing. Her bag contained her wallet, the book, 2 hair ties, a lip balm, a small packet of tissues, and a tin of mints that she kept meaning to throw out. 12 miles was 4 hours of walking at a brisk pace on good ground. On this ground, in these boots, in these conditions, it was longer. She was burning calories fast. She had eaten dinner at 6, pasta, half a glass of wine, and it was now after 10. If she stopped moving, she would be dead before morning. She got up off the road, brushed the snow from her coat and her gloves, and kept walking. The first hour was the worst because she was still in the acute phase of shock. Not hypothermia, not yet, but the psychological vertigo of having the architecture of your life demolished in a single conversation. Her mind kept returning to Vincent's face, not the words, the face, the particular emptied quality of it when he told her to get out of the car, as though she were an object being removed from inventory rather than a person he had shared a bed with for 5 years, a person who had restructured her entire existence around the facts of his life. She had loved him. That was the piece she kept arriving at and not being able to move past. She had loved him with the specific, wide-eyed intensity of someone who believes they have found the person beneath the reputation, who believes that the private man is different from the public one, that the gentleness she experienced in quiet moments was the true thing and the violence was the mask. She had believed that with a conviction that now felt less like love and more like a clinical delusion she had maintained at significant personal cost. The second hour was better because the shock was metabolizing into something else. It moved through anger, saw it? A clean, hot, clarifying anger that actually helped with the cold, that made her walk faster and hit the ground harder and feel, briefly, something other than the temperature, and then past anger into a colder territory that had no name she knew. A territory where the things you believed about yourself were stripped of their context, and you had to look at them plainly. She had helped Marco with the accounts. She had done it because she wanted to be useful, because she wanted Vincent to see her as more than ornamental, because she had a skill and she wanted to use it. She had not asked enough questions about what she was helping to build, or why, or what the money was exactly, and where it had come from before it needed to be moved. She had not asked because the marriage she'd been living in for 5 years had taught her that certain questions weren't asked, that there were rooms you didn't enter, that there was a structure of willful ignorance that everyone in Vincent's world maintained because it was more comfortable than knowing. She had participated in that structure. She had been complicit in it. She had benefited from it. The house, the coat, the life. And she had paid for that complicity now in the currency of a snowy road in January and the retreating taillights of her husband's SUV. That reckoning sat in her chest and burned there as she walked, and she didn't look away from it because there was nothing else to look at, and she needed the burn to keep moving. But somewhere in the second hour she found the cabin. It was set back from the road about 30 yards, invisible until she was nearly past it because the tree line hid it from the south and the snow had erased most of the clearing around it. What she saw first was not the structure, but the absence of trees, a gap in the wall of dark pines, and then the low outline of a roof with snow piled on it, and a door. She left the road and waded through knee-high drifts to reach it, the snow going over the tops of her boots in the first few steps, soaking through her stockings, the cold of it climbing her legs with a thoroughness that made her jaw clench. The cabin was small, one room, judging by the footprint, and locked with a padlock that had seized with rust and cold so thoroughly that when she found a rock in the snow and hit it 4 times with everything she had, the lock didn't open. The hasp pulled free from the door frame instead, the screws giving way, and she fell backward into the snow and then scrambled forward through the open door and pulled it shut behind her. Dark, cold, but no wind. The absence of wind was so profound after 2 hours of it that she sat on the floor just inside the door and experienced the relief of it as something close to physical pleasure, her whole body registering the change in pressure. She didn't move for 3 minutes. Then she got up and began learning what the cabin contained. Her phone's flashlight was not available to her. She worked by touch and by the faint light that came through a single small window that the snow had not entirely covered. The cabin was a hunting blind or a maintenance shelter. Bare wood walls, a plank floor, 2 wooden chairs, a small table, a metal locker in the corner. Against the far wall was a cast iron stove, and beside the stove was a metal bin with a lid, and inside the bin, she felt the texture of it before she understood it, was firewood. Split hardwood, dry, maybe a season old. There were matches in a tin on a shelf above the stove. Waterproof matches, the kind hunters use. She made a fire. It took 4 attempts and 20 minutes, and by the end her hands were shaking badly enough that she dropped the first lit match before it reached the kindling. But she made it. The fire caught, and the cast iron began radiating heat, and Elena Voss sat on the floor with her back against the stove and let the warmth move through her. She sat there for a long time, not thinking about Vincent, not thinking about Marco or the federal deposition or the account she'd helped structure 6 years ago. Thinking about the fire. Thinking about heat. Thinking about the specific, urgent business of being alive, which was, when you stripped everything else away, the only business that mattered right now. She had survived the night that was supposed to end her story. That was the fact. Everything else was downstream of that fact. She found a sleeping bag in the metal locker, along with a box of protein bars that were 2 years past their printed date, a half-full bottle of water, and a first aid kit containing, among other things, a small flashlight with a battery that still worked. She ate 2 protein bars, drank half the water, got into the sleeping bag fully clothed, boots included, and slept for 5 hours on the plank floor with the stove keeping the cabin survivable. She woke to gray light through the window and the fire reduced to coals, and her mind fully operational in the way it was when she woke from the hard, flat sleep of exhaustion. No grogginess, no transition, just the sudden presence of consciousness, and with it, the complete architecture of her situation. She rebuilt the fire from the coals, ate one more protein bar, and spent an hour thinking. The federal deposition changed everything and also changed nothing. If Marco had given her name to federal investigators, she was a person of interest in a wire fraud case that also touched money laundering, possibly racketeering, possibly more. Her name on the Waveland house was public record. Her marriage to Vincent was public record. She was not, as of this morning, a fugitive. You were not a fugitive simply because someone mentioned your name in a deposition, but she was a target. She was a target for the federal investigators who would want to use her as a wedge into Vincent's organization. She was a target for Vincent's enemies, who would consider her valuable leverage. And she was, if Vincent decided that his first attempt to eliminate her had been insufficient, a target for the organization itself. She could not go back to Waveland. She could not go to anyone in Vincent's world. She had friends, women she had brunch with, people she had known before the marriage. But 5 years of living in Vincent's orbit had eroded those friendships the way that particular life eroded everything that was not directly useful to it, and she could not now appear on any of their doorsteps with a story that would make her a liability to anyone who helped her. What she had, a wallet with $430 in cash, 2 credit cards that Vincent had access to and that she could not use without being found immediately, a Northwestern degree in finance, and a mind that had just spent 2 hours in a snowstorm doing the kind of clear, survival-oriented thinking that strips away everything decorative and leaves only the structural. What she needed, distance, time, a new identity of sufficient quality to remain invisible while she built something from nothing. She knew how money moved. She had demonstrated that 6 years ago. She understood systems of concealment. She understood the architecture of organizations built to be invisible. She had 5 years of intimate education in how power operated, who held it, what it was built on, and crucially, where it was most fragile. She had been trained, without knowing she was being trained, by the man who had just tried to kill her. Elena fed the last of the firewood into the stove, pulled on her coat, checked the flashlight battery, and opened the cabin door. The snow had stopped. The morning was clear and cold and absolutely still, the kind of still that exists after a storm, when the world seems to have held its breath and not yet decided to exhale. The road was under 18 inches of fresh snow. The trees were laden. The sky was the pale blue of deep winter at 7 in the morning. She walked toward the road and stood in it for a moment, looking east, where the town was, 12 miles or no, and looking west, where the road curved back into darkness. Then she went east and didn't look back. Not because looking back was dangerous, because it was pointless. Vincent had made his choice. She had been remade by it, in the hours since the door closed, into something she was still learning the shape of. Whatever she was now, it was not the woman he had left at the side of the road. That woman was gone. The town was called Millhaven, and it had a population of 2,200 and a gas station that doubled as a diner. And Elena walked into it at 11:47 in the morning, 4.5 hours after leaving the cabin, with snow-ruined boots and a face that she knew from the reflection in the gas station window looked like someone who had been through something serious. The woman behind the counter was in her 60s with cropped gray hair and the particular quality of attention that people develop when they work in small towns and see things that don't fit the ordinary pattern. She looked at Elena the way that woman looked, steady, assessing, not unkind. "Coffee?" she said. "Please," Elena said. "And whatever you have that's hot." She sat in a booth in the corner with her back to the wall. She had always preferred her back to the wall. Vincent used to say it was the only Mafia habit she'd picked up without realizing it. And she ate scrambled eggs and toast and 3 cups of coffee and watched the door and thought. She needed to make 3 calls. None of them could be made on a traceable phone. The gas station had a payphone mounted on the exterior wall. She had noticed it walking in, had cataloged it, had begun planning for it before she was through the door. The first call was to a woman named Judith Crane, who had been 2 years ahead of Elena at Northwestern, who had left finance to become an estate attorney in Portland, and who was one of the few people Elena had maintained any contact with from her pre-Vincent life. Not friendship, exactly. They were not close enough for that word, but a thread, thin and intermittent, a card at Christmas, A brief exchange every 18 months or so that preserved the connection without demanding anything of it. Judith answered on the third ring with the voice of someone who was in the middle of something and expected the call to be brief. Judith, it's Elena. A pause. Elena Voss. Yes. It's been, I know, I need help. Not the kind you're probably imagining. I need to know if you can receive a wire transfer from an account that won't exist in 3 days and not ask me anything about it for 6 months. Another pause. Longer. That's an unusual request. I know. Are you in danger? Elena looked out the gas station window at the empty main street of Mill Haven, at the snow banked against the curbs, at a dog trotting purposefully across an intersection in the middle distance. Not right now, she said. But I'm going to be, and I need to not be findable while I figure out how not to be. She could hear Judith breathing on the other end. She could hear the particular quality of a smart person's silence when they were doing rapid ethical calculation. I can receive a transfer, Judith said finally. I'm going to assume it's a fee for services, and I'm going to build a file that says that. If anyone ever asks, no one's going to ask you. Elena. Judith's voice had lost the brisk quality. Something more careful was underneath it. Whatever happened? Are you okay? Elena thought about the road in the dark and the retreating taillights and the 2 hours of walking and the match she dropped on the first try and the fire that finally caught. I will be, she said. It was the first time she had said anything she entirely believed. Bang. The second call was to a man named Oscar Tran, who ran a document service out of a print shop in Wicker Park that officially produced wedding invitations and business cards, and also, for the right people with the right referral and the right amount of cash, produced documentation of a more substantial kind. Elena had known about Oscar through the organization, had heard his name in conversations she was not supposed to remember, and had filed the information away in the manner she filed everything, without knowing then that she was building a library she would one day need to withdraw from. Oscar did not ask questions. That was his professional virtue. She gave him the number of a prepaid card she bought from the gas station's rack with cash, and she told him what she needed, and he told her what it would cost, and she told him where to send it, and they were done in 4 minutes. The third call she didn't make. The third call was to Vincent's number, which she had memorized the way you memorize numbers you dialed every day for 5 years. And she stood at the payphone for a long moment with her finger on the 0 and thought about what she would say. She put the receiver back without dialing. There was nothing to say. Not yet. Not from here. Not from this side of whatever she was going to build. She left Mill Haven 2 days later on a Greyhound bus, sitting in the third row with a window seat, watching Illinois give way to Wisconsin through glass that fogged at the edges from the bus's inadequate heating. She was carrying a new prepaid phone, $1,200 in cash that she had acquired through a sequence of legitimate but creative transactions she preferred not to document even mentally, and the embryonic architecture of a plan that was still mostly instinct but was beginning to develop the kind of structure that could eventually bear weight. She did not look back at Mill Haven as the bus pulled onto the highway. She did not think about the house on Waveland, or the dinner she had been eating when the men knocked on the back door, or the particular quality of Vincent's eyes when he pushed the passenger door open from the inside. She thought forward. Only forward. The woman she was becoming did not have a name yet, but she was learning the shape of her the way you learn the shape of something in the dark, by feel, by what it was not, by the edges of it, gradually, with the patience of someone who has run out of any other option. Outside, the winter highway stretched out flat and gray and enormous, and Elena Voss pressed her forehead against the cold glass and let it ground her, the chill of it a reminder of the night she had survived, of the fire she had built from nothing, of the morning she had walked out of the snow and into whatever came next. She had been left to disappear. She had different plans. Chiquit. 3 weeks later, a brief item appeared in the Chicago Tribune's Metro section. 3 sentences, no photo. Noting that Elena Moretti, wife of prominent real estate developer Vincent Moretti, had been reported missing. Sources close to the family indicated she had left voluntarily following personal difficulties in the marriage. Police were not treating the disappearance as suspicious. Vincent Moretti, reached for comment, said only that he hoped his wife was safe and asked that the family's privacy be respected during this difficult time. He was photographed 2 days later at a benefit dinner on the North Shore, smiling, his hand on the shoulder of a city alderman, looking like a man who had handled a difficult situation and returned to the ordinary business of power. He looked like a man with no outstanding problems. He was wrong about that. But it would be 3 years before he understood how wrong, and by then the understanding would arrive not as information but as consequence, delivered piece by piece through the systematic and unhurried destruction of everything he had built, by the woman who had walked 12 miles through a January snowstorm and decided, somewhere in the cold and the dark and the long counting of her own breath, that disappearing was not the same thing as being defeated. Elena Voss was gone. What was coming in her place was something Vincent Moretti had no framework for because he had never considered the possibility. He had left her in the snow. He had no idea what the snow had made her into. 3 years is long enough to become unrecognizable. Not in the way of disguise, prosthetics, and dyed hair, and a practiced limp, but in the deeper way. The way that happens when a person is taken apart by circumstance and reassembles themselves according to a different blueprint. Elena Voss had spent 3 years doing exactly that, and the result was a woman who shared the original's bone structure and eye color and the particular quality of stillness that settled over her face when she was thinking hard about something, but who operated from a place so different from the woman Vincent had pushed out of an SUV on a winter road that she might as well have been a different species. She came back to Chicago in October, when the lake wind had turned cold again, but the snow hadn't arrived yet, and the city had that particular autumn quality of bracing itself. She did not come back as Elena Moretti or Elena Voss. She came back as Claire Ashworth, British-educated financial consultant with a London address, a Swiss banking relationship, and a professional history that was entirely fabricated, but fabricated with the kind of granular detail that collapsed under inspection only if you knew exactly where to press. And the people she would be dealing with would not know where to press, because the people she would be dealing with were not investigators. They were ambitious second-tier operators in the criminal ecosystem Vincent Moretti occupied, men who were dissatisfied with their positions and looking for a smarter patron, and what they needed from her was not a verified biography. What they needed was competence and money, both of which she had. She took an apartment in River North under the Ashworth name. 12th floor, corner unit, 2 exits from the building, a direct sightline from the living room window to the street below. She had learned to assess spaces that way, cataloging exits and sightlines before she assessed anything else. The habit developed in the years since the road and refined into something automatic. She had spent 3 years building what she thought of as the architecture, the financial structures, the network of relationships, the layered shell companies that moved money and obscured ownership with the elegance she had demonstrated at 28, but had now refined over thousands of hours of careful, patient construction. She had done it from Portland, then from Toronto, then from a 2-room apartment in Montreal where she had lived for 14 months on $6,000 and a laptop and the kind of focused, tunnel vision discipline that only becomes possible when you have stripped your life down to a single purpose. She had not spent those 3 years planning revenge. That word was too simple and too hot for what she was doing. Revenge was a feeling. What she was building was a mechanism. Vincent Moretti's empire in the 3rd year following Elena's disappearance was not the empire it had been. The federal investigation that Marco Bianchi's deposition had initiated had not resulted in indictments. Vincent's lawyers were expensive and effective, and Marco had died of a cardiac event in county lockup 7 months after his arrest, which was convenient in a way that generated speculation but not charges. But the investigation had forced structural changes that weakened the organization in ways that were not immediately visible and were not immediately fatal, but were the kind of weakness that compounds over time. 2 of Vincent's 3 largest revenue operations had been shuttered or moved offshore. The political relationships that had provided cover for the organization's real estate activities had become more expensive to maintain as the aldermen and commissioners who benefited from them grew nervous about their own exposure. 3 of his most capable lieutenants had either been arrested on peripheral charges, departed voluntarily for other arrangements, or in one case simply stopped appearing at meetings and was eventually understood to have relocated to Miami with no forwarding communication. The organization still functioned. Vincent still controlled significant territory and significant cash flow. But the architecture of the thing had developed stress fractures, and the men who remained in it were aware of the stress fractures in the way that people in buildings with stress fractures are aware of them, peripherally, uneasily, without wanting to look directly at the problem. Into this environment, Claire Ashworth arrived. Her first contact was a man named Danny Reese, who had spent 11 years as Vincent's logistics coordinator before being demoted following the federal investigation to a role that was essentially administrative. Danny was 44, divorced, carrying the particular resentment of someone who believes they were made a scapegoat for a superior's failures, and he drank at a bar called Hendrix on Tuesday and Thursday evenings with a regularity that she had confirmed through 3 weeks of observation before she sat down next to him. She bought him a drink. She let him talk about his grievances. She was good at letting people talk about their grievances, had learned that skill at 31 in a Montreal apartment, reading everything she could find about the psychology of organizational loyalty and its dissolution. She asked questions that were smart, but not too smart, that demonstrated understanding of the logistics business without demonstrating knowledge of his specific operation. She let the conversation find its own level. By the second drink, Danny was talking about Vincent with the specificity that people use when they've been waiting for an audience. He burned 3 people to get through the investigation, Danny said. He was on his 3rd bourbon, the ice mostly melted, his posture that of a man who was making the drink do work that the work environment should have been doing. People who were loyal. People who kept their mouths shut when keeping their mouths shut cost them something. And then when the lawyers needed names to put at the bottom of the document so Moretti's name wasn't on them, that was us. That was me and Carla and Pete Ferrario. All of us took paper that should have had his name on it. And you couldn't push back on that, Elena said. You push back on Vincent Moretti, you get sent to run receivables for a property management company in Bridgeport, which is what I'm doing now. He looked at his glass. 11 years. I knew where every truck was at every hour. I knew every driver and every route and every handoff point. And now I'm processing late rent payments from people who can't make their lease. She let the silence hold for a moment. Then she said, "What would you do with a different patron? Someone with resources and a longer view?" Danny looked at her. He was not a stupid man. Stupid men don't survive 11 years in Vincent's logistics operation. And she watched him doing the recalibration that people do when a conversation shifts from venting to proposition. "Depends on the patron," he said. "Of course it does." "And the ask?" "Information," she said. "And eventually, when the timing is right, a choice about where your loyalty actually lives." Danny looked at his glass again. Then he looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been waiting for a door to open and was now deciding whether the hallway on the other side was better or worse than the room he was in. "You're not a consultant," he said. "I'm exactly what I told you I am," Elena said. "What I do with the consulting is my business." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside Hendrix, a car alarm went off and then stopped. The bartender replaced someone's drink without being asked. "What kind of information?" Danny said. "Ptit." Over the following 6 weeks, she cultivated 4 more contacts inside or adjacent to Vincent's organization, using approaches tailored to each. Danny's resentment, a bookkeeper named Sylvia's financial anxiety, a mid-level operator named Cruz, whose primary motivation was ambition rather than grievance, and a city planning official named Hargrove, whose connection to Vincent's real estate operations had become a source of terror rather than profit since the federal investigation began. She was methodical. She was patient in a way that the 3 years had built into her at a structural level. Patience not as temperament but as practice, as the deliberate suppression of urgency in favor of the longer timeline. She took nothing she didn't need yet. She built relationships without converting them into actions, because actions created footprints, and she was not ready to be seen. What she was learning through Danny's information and Sylvia's numbers and Cruz's operational gossip was the precise location of Vincent's remaining structural vulnerabilities. She was mapping the stress fractures she had intuited from outside, confirming them with inside data, identifying the points where pressure would propagate most efficiently through the organization's load-bearing elements. She did not share this mapping with anyone. It lived in her head and in an encrypted file on a laptop that communicated with no network she did not control. She was building the case, not the federal case. That was its own machinery, running on its own timeline, and she had no interest in handing Vincent to investigators who would negotiate his sentence down to something manageable and let him rebuild from a minimum security arrangement. She was building something more personal, more total. She wanted him to watch it happen. That was the specific thing. She wanted him to understand in real time what was being done and by whom and why. And she wanted that understanding to arrive too late for him to stop it. It was Cruz who first told Vincent. She hadn't anticipated that specifically, though she had built contingency for early exposure. It was always a probability, not a possibility, that one of her contacts would talk, because people were unreliable, and her network was young, and none of these relationships had been tested under any real pressure. Cruz told Vincent in November, 5 weeks after she'd first made contact with him, in a meeting at a restaurant in Bridgeport, that Elena's surveillance of Cruz's communication patterns had not predicted because Cruz had arranged it through a channel she hadn't yet mapped. She found out about the meeting through Danny, who heard about it third hand 2 days later, and she sat with that information for 4 hours in her River North apartment before she decided what it changed. What it changed was the timeline, not the plan. She had expected months before Vincent became aware of her existence in the city. Now he was aware, or would be soon, though what he was aware of was Claire Ashworth, a consultant, a name, a professional surface with nothing underneath it that pointed back to Elena Voss. She had been meticulous about that separation. The Ashworth identity was built on documentation that Oscar Tran had produced, and she had subsequently reinforced with 3 years of careful backstory construction. There was nothing in it that would survive a serious forensic investigation, but Vincent Moretti did not have access to forensic investigators on the relevant timeline, and the people he would put on this problem were the people in his organization, who were already compromised and understaffed and dealing with the federal investigation's ongoing demands on their attention. She had 4 days, she estimated, before Vincent's people traced Claire Ashworth far enough to generate serious uncertainty about who she was. In those 4 days, she needed to move 3 of her 4 financial mechanisms from preliminary to active, which would begin the visible phase of what she was doing, the phase where Vincent's operations started experiencing problems that didn't have obvious causes. She moved the timeline up. She made 3 calls. She transferred authorization on the financial instruments she had been staging for 6 months. She activated Cruz's replacement, a woman named Teresa who worked in Vincent's accounting department, and who had been a secondary contact Elena had been developing in parallel because she always had parallel contacts, because redundancy was the foundation of durable systems. Then she waited to see what Vincent would do with the name Claire Ashworth. He sent 2 men to her building on a Wednesday afternoon. She saw them from the window before they reached the lobby. 2 men in dark coats moving with the particular purposeful economy of people on an errand, not tourists, not residents, the kind of purposefulness that had a job title underneath it. She watched them enter the building. She gave them 4 minutes to reach her floor, which she knew from her own movements in the building was the right amount of time for the elevator and the walk down the corridor. Then she picked up her bag, packed and ready, had been ready for 2 weeks, and took the stairs to the garage. She was 3 blocks away when her phone showed her the building's lobby camera feed, which she had tapped into on her 3rd day in the apartment. The 2 men were at the front desk. The desk attendant was making a call, presumably to her unit, which would ring unanswered. She walked east toward the lake and let the cold come off the water and thought about what this meant in terms of sequencing. It meant Vincent was moving faster than his organization's current capacity should have allowed, which meant he was taking the Ashworth situation seriously enough to prioritize resources he didn't have to spare. That was useful information. It meant he was worried. It meant that some fragment of what she was doing had reached him in a form that communicated threat rather than nuisance. Good. She changed hotels that night, using a 3rd identity she had held in reserve, and from the new room she reviewed the activity reports from the financial mechanisms she had activated 2 days earlier. 3 of Vincent's shell companies had experienced what would look, from the inside, like routine banking complications. Holds on accounts pending compliance reviews, transfers flagged for documentation requests, a credit line suspended pending updated beneficial ownership disclosure. None of it was catastrophic individually. Collectively, it was the financial equivalent of developing a persistent cough. Nothing that stopped you, but something that made you aware that a system was not running as it should. She added 2 more actions to the queue. She sent a message to a journalist at the Tribune's business desk, not the Metro desk, the business desk, which covered the legitimate face of Vincent's real estate operations, flagging an inconsistency in a property transfer filing that was publicly available and entirely accurate and would, if the journalist was competent, lead to a story that would create problems for the bank relationships Vincent had been carefully reconstructing since the federal investigation. Then she ordered room service and ate it at the desk and reviewed her contact list and thought about Danny Reese and whether his information pipeline to Vincent's inner circle was still intact, or whether Cruz's conversation had prompted a security review that would have identified Danny as a leak. Her phone buzzed. Danny's number. "He knows it's you," Danny said. No preamble. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, a thinness, a frequency of genuine fear underneath the words. She was quiet for a moment. What specifically does he know? He knows Claire Ashworth is connected to Elena. He doesn't know how. He doesn't know what you look like now, but he knows. A pause. He said, "And I'm telling you this because you paid me to tell you things, and also because I think you should understand what you're dealing with." He said he should have made sure the first time. The sentence sat in the air between the phone and her ear. She let it sit. She noted the way her pulse registered it, a single elevated beat, then steady, the body's way of acknowledging a threat and then returning to function. "How did he find out it was me?" she asked. "The accounts." Sylvia said the structuring approach on 2 of the shells matched something from 6 years ago. She recognized the pattern. Sylvia, the bookkeeper. Of course, the one contact she had assessed as motivated purely by financial anxiety, the one she had thought least likely to report back because people driven by fear tended to protect themselves through silence rather than disclosure. She had been wrong about Sylvia's calculation. Sylvia had decided that disclosing to Vincent was the better protection than staying quiet. She noted the error. She would not make the same assessment again. "Are you safe?" she asked Danny. "I don't know yet." "Get out of the city tonight. I'll have funds at the Portland address by morning." She hung up before he could answer and sat in the hotel room with the half-eaten room service going cold on the desk and the city lights coming through the window and thought about what had just changed. Vincent knew who she was. He did not know where she was, but he knew who she was, which meant the surface-level protection of the Ashworth identity was gone. She was operating now as herself, not as Elena Moretti, not as the woman who had been left on a road, but as the thing she had built from that woman, the mechanism she had spent 3 years constructing, and that mechanism was now visible to the man it had been built to dismantle. She had planned for this. She had not planned for it to happen this early. She opened her laptop and began moving the timeline up by 60 days, compressing the sequencing, accepting the risks that came with compression, because the alternative was allowing Vincent to stabilize while she waited for the original schedule to play out. Her hands were steady on the keyboard. That surprised her, slightly. And then it didn't, because she understood by now that the version of herself that had been afraid of Vincent Moretti had gone into the snow 3 years ago and had not come back out. What had come back out did not have the luxury of fear. She worked until 3 in the morning, then closed the laptop and turned off the light, and in the dark of the hotel room she lay on top of the covers with her coat still on and her bag by the door, and she thought about Sylvia recognizing the pattern in the account structuring. And she thought about the fact that the pattern was hers, genuinely hers, the specific mathematical fingerprint of the way her mind moved money. And she thought that Vincent had known her mind for 5 years and had still not understood what it was capable of. He was about to learn. The only question now was whether she could move fast enough to stay ahead of what he'd do with the knowledge that Elena Voss was not dead, was not gone, and was already inside the walls of everything he had built. Not as a ghost, not as a threat from outside, but as the architect of his collapse, working from the blueprint she had spent 3 years drafting in the cold and the quiet of the life he had left her to build without him. Her phone lit up once on the nightstand. A notification from the financial monitoring system she had built to track Vincent's account activity in real time. She looked at it without picking up the phone. 3 accounts had attempted to reverse the holds she had placed on them. The reversals had failed because the compliance flags she had filed were legitimate and the documentation requests were real, and the process for clearing them would take a minimum of 30 business days, regardless of how much money or pressure Vincent applied to it. She set the phone face down and closed her eyes. 30 business days, 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks before that particular pressure valve released, and in those 6 weeks she needed to finish what she had started in a way that could not be reversed. Not by lawyers, not by political connections, not by the application of violence, because violence required a target, and she intended to remain a moving one. She was almost asleep when the second notification came. She didn't look at it. She already knew what it would say because she had scheduled it herself 3 months ago from a laptop in a Montreal apartment to deliver on this exact date if all preceding conditions were met. A message to the city planning department from an anonymous public interest filing, formally requesting a review of the beneficial ownership structure of 14 properties in Vincent Moretti's real estate portfolio. 14 properties. Every one of them carrying a history that could not survive a serious ownership review. The machine was running now. It had been running since she walked out of the snow 3 years ago, and it had been quiet and patient and invisible, and now it was none of those things, and there was nothing Vincent Moretti could do to stop it. Because the thing about a mechanism built from the inside is that the man on the outside doesn't know which wall to push against. He was going to find out. She was going to make sure he understood, when it happened, exactly who had built it and why. That was the part that wasn't about money or power or the systematic destruction of an organization. That was the part that was personal. That was the part she had been honest with herself about in the cabin, sitting on the floor with her back against a cast iron stove, watching a fire she had built from nothing burn against the cold. She wanted him to know it was her. She wanted him to look at the wreckage and understand whose hands had made it. And she wanted to be standing in front of him when he did, close enough to see his face when the last thing he had left. The belief that he had made the right call on that road, that she had been the weak variable, that eliminating her had been the necessary and correct decision, collapsed under the weight of everything she had become since he drove away. Outside, the Chicago wind hit the hotel window with a sound like a held breath released, and Elena Voss closed her eyes and slept. The planning department filing went public on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by the Tribune's business desk. The journalist she had flagged it to, a 32-year-old named Carver, who had the specific hungry quality of a reporter who had been waiting for a story with real teeth. And by Friday afternoon, 3 of Vincent's banking partners had made inquiries through their legal departments about the beneficial ownership documentation on loans that collectively represented $41 million in outstanding credit. Elena read the Tribune piece in a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, at a corner table, with her back to the wall. It was measured, careful journalism. Carver was good enough to know that printing ahead of the documentation meant liability, but it asked the right questions in the right order, and the questions themselves were the damage. The questions told every bank, every partner, every political ally still connected to Vincent Moretti that the ground beneath his real estate portfolio had developed a geology problem. And in that world, questions were frequently worse than answers because answers were finite and questions compounded. Her phone showed 3 messages from Teresa in Vincent's accounting department, each more compressed than the last. The third one said only, "Internal meeting called. All department heads. 10 a.m. Saturday. He's pulling people in." She read that last message and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was the faint, uncomfortable pressure of a timeline moving faster than her revised schedule could accommodate. She had compressed the plan by 60 days following Vincent's identification of her, but the filing's acceleration, the speed with which Carver had moved, the speed with which the banks had reacted, had compressed it further still, and compressed timelines created gaps, and gaps were where things went wrong. She ordered another coffee and sat with that feeling and examined it the way she examined most uncomfortable things, directly, without flinching, without the consolation of telling herself it was smaller than it appeared. The Saturday meeting was the problem. If Vincent was pulling all department heads into a room, he was either preparing a containment strategy or, and this was the possibility she had to sit with, he had already identified more of her network than Danny's warning had indicated. If Teresa was in that meeting, Teresa's pipeline to Elena would go dark, possibly permanently. If Teresa went dark before Elena completed the documentation package she needed for the ownership review to reach its critical threshold, the review would stall at the preliminary stage and give Vincent's lawyers enough surface area to file for an injunction. She needed the documentation package completed before Saturday morning. It was Friday at 11:47. She left the coffee shop and walked north into the wind. The documentation package required 4 source files that Teresa had been extracting in fragments over the preceding 3 weeks, delivering them in pieces through a dead drop protocol Elena had established. An email account that neither of them accessed from their own devices, where one left a draft and the other read it and deleted it, and neither party ever sent a message that could be traced as communication. 3 of the 4 source files were complete. The 4th was a transfer log from 2019 that detailed the movement of funds through the shell company structure during the period when Vincent's organization had been most aggressively expanding its real estate holdings. And it was the most important of the 4, because it was the one that demonstrated the connection between the criminal revenue and the property acquisitions in a way that the ownership filings alone could not. Teresa had the transfer log. She had confirmed it 3 days ago, confirmed she had located it in a legacy archive that Vincent's internal audit during the Federal Investigations Compliance Review had failed to flag for destruction. The log existed, physically, in a filing cabinet in a storage room adjacent to the accounting department's main office. Elena called Teresa from a burner phone she had not used before. Teresa answered on the second ring, which was wrong. Teresa never answered the burner on the first or second ring, always waited for 4. A protocol they had established on the first day of their arrangement as a signal that she was alone and clear. 2 rings meant something was different. "I can't talk," Teresa said. Her voice had the flattened quality of someone managing the acoustic output of panic. "I need the 4th file today." "I know you do. I can't get it today." Teresa, he called Marcus in last night. Marcus was Teresa's direct supervisor, the accounting department head. Marcus spent 2 hours with Vincent's security people. I don't know what they said to him, but this morning Marcus came in and changed the access codes on the archive room and put a camera on the door. A breath. "There's a camera on the door, Claire." Claire. She was still Claire to Teresa. Elena registered that and moved past it. "Is the file still in the cabinet?" "As far as I know." "Can you get into the room through any other access?" "The supply corridor connects, but it shares the same keypad and the camera covers the corridor entrance too." Teresa's voice dropped further. "I think Marcus told them about the archive. I think that's what the meeting was about. I think they know something is missing, or they know someone was looking." Elena stopped walking. She was on a block of Michigan Avenue where the pedestrian traffic was thin, the wind coming off the lake with enough force that she had to turn partially away from it to keep the phone pressed to her ear. She stood there for a moment with the cold hitting the side of her face and thought through what she was hearing. "Did Marcus say anything to you directly?" she asked. "He told the whole department that there would be a compliance review of archive access logs going back 18 months. He said it was routine." A pause. "It is not routine." "No, it was not." Elena ended the call and walked to the corner and stood at the light and watched the cars move through the intersection and felt the shape of the problem she was now inside. Without the transfer log, the ownership review would stall. With the review stalled, Vincent's lawyers had room to maneuver. With room to maneuver, the banking inquiries would be addressed and resolved, and the Tribune story would remain a question rather than becoming an answer. The mechanism she had built would not stop. The financial holds were real, the shells were compromised, the damage already done was real, but it would lose its momentum at the critical moment. The moment when momentum was the only thing that prevented the target from regaining enough stability to fight back effectively. She needed the log. She needed it in the next 16 hours. She was going to have to get it herself. She spent 2 hours on reconnaissance, which was not a word she would have used 3 years ago for anything she did, but which was the accurate word now for the process of establishing the physical layout, security infrastructure, staffing patterns, and access vulnerabilities of a building she had never entered. Vincent's accounting operation ran out of a floor-through office on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop that officially housed a property management company called Meridian Urban Partners. She had the address from Teresa's early disclosures, had the floor plan from a commercial real estate listing that had been active when Meridian first leased the space 4 years ago, had a partial understanding of the security from Teresa's incidental descriptions of her daily routine. What she didn't have was current intelligence on the camera placement, the after-hours security protocol, or whether Vincent's people, now aware that something was being extracted from their systems, had added personnel to the building. She stood across the street from the building's lobby entrance at 1 in the afternoon and watched for 40 minutes. She noted the security desk in the lobby, staffed by a single guard. She noted the elevator bank. She noted that the building had a loading dock on its south side, accessible from a service alley. She noted that the commercial floors had separate after-hours access using tenant key cards, which meant the lobby guard was not the only access control. She went to a hardware store and bought 2 items. She went to a pharmacy and bought 1 item. She went back to her hotel and changed into clothes that were dark and without distinguishing features, and sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap and spent 15 minutes doing nothing but breathing, because what she was about to do was categorically different from everything she had done in the preceding 3 years, and she needed her nervous system to understand that she was choosing it and not being pushed into it, because people who felt pushed made mistakes that people who felt chosen did not. She was choosing it. She left the hotel at 7:45 in the evening. Mesite. The loading dock was unlocked. Not negligently, but because a catering company had delivered for a tenant event on the 11th floor and had propped the service entrance with a rubber wedge that the last member of their crew hadn't kicked loose. Elena found it on her first check of the perimeter, which was the kind of luck she did not trust, but also did not refuse. She went in through the service entrance and up the service stairs to the 14th floor, which required bypassing a stairwell door that was supposed to be locked from the stairwell side but was not, because the magnetic locks receiver had been painted over during a renovation and made intermittent contact that a firm push resolved. 2 pieces of luck in 20 minutes. She noted them and moved faster, because luck that came in clusters tended to have a debt attached. The 14th floor's main corridor was dim, after-hours lighting, motion-activated, the kind that comes on at 30% and brightens when you move under it. She moved through it in a way that minimized the motion triggers, not successfully invisible, but successfully ordinary-looking, a person navigating a familiar office after hours, which was exactly what she intended to project if anyone saw her. No one saw her. The accounting department occupied the west side of the floor. The door required a key card she didn't have. She used the item from the pharmacy, a particular kind of contact solution bottle that she had emptied and refilled. On the card reader's faceplate, a technique she had read about and never expected to actually use, and which did not work the way it worked in the videos she had watched, and she stood at the door for 4 minutes trying 3 different approaches before the reader's LED went from red to a green that she didn't entirely trust, and the door clicked. The archive room was where the floor plan said it would be. The corridor leading to it had a camera mounted above the door, angled to cover the door, and approximately 6 feet of corridor in either direction. She studied it for a moment. It was a standard IP camera, the kind that recorded to a local server and also, in many configurations, streamed to a monitoring service. She could not disable it without tools she didn't have. She could not avoid it entirely given its coverage angle. She moved through its field of view with her face turned at an angle that made positive identification difficult, the way people move through casino floors when they understand the cameras are overhead and everywhere, not hiding, not running, just declining to present their face cleanly to the lens. The archive room's keypad used a 4-digit code. She had 4 candidates from Teresa's descriptions of the department's security habits. The code that Marcus had changed was the 3rd one she tried. The room was cold and smelled of old paper and the specific alkaline dryness of stored files. She found the cabinet Teresa had described in the 2nd row. It was locked with a standard filing cabinet lock that she opened in 40 seconds with one of the items from the hardware store, a technique that required practice she had acquired in Montreal and that made her feel, briefly, like someone from a film she wouldn't have expected herself to inhabit. The transfer log was a physical file, Actual paper, printed and bound, with a cover sheet marked Internal. Meridian Reconciliation, Q3 to Q4, 2019. She opened it and scanned the first 3 pages with her phone camera, then stopped, because the information density was high enough that she needed to capture it fully and accurately, not in fragments. And she had a portable document scanner in her bag that she had been carrying for 3 weeks in anticipation of exactly this moment. She scanned all 47 pages. It took 11 minutes. Her hands were steady throughout, which she noticed because she expected them not to be. She put the file back in the cabinet exactly as she had found it. She locked the cabinet. She exited the archive room and relocked the door. She walked back through the corridor to the stairwell. She was on the street outside the loading dock at 9:22 in the evening. She had the file. She walked 4 blocks before she let herself feel anything, and what she felt when she let herself feel it was not relief, but a cold, clear awareness that she had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that the woman who had been building a financial mechanism from a distance for 3 years had now physically entered the infrastructure of Vincent's organization, had been on the same floor as his operation, had touched his files with her hands, that she had left traces that his security review would eventually find, that the camera in the corridor had her profile on it, even if it didn't have her face. She had the log. The log would complete the documentation package. The package would go to the Ownership Review Commission in the morning, and when it did, the review would have everything it needed to reach the threshold where an injunction became impossible, where the documentation was already in official hands, and Vincent's lawyers were fighting a fire that had already burned down the building they were trying to protect. She told herself this was the calculation that mattered, and that the traces she had left were manageable. She was wrong. Siam. Her hotel room door was open, not wide open, slightly open, the way doors are left when someone has entered without intending to announce themselves, where the latch didn't catch because the person closing it from the inside didn't want the sound of a click in an empty corridor. She stood in the hallway outside her room for a long moment with the scanned file on her phone and the door slightly open in front of her and the quiet of the corridor around her. She did not go in. She went to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, walked out through a side exit she had identified on her first day in the hotel, and called a car from 2 blocks away. In the car, she opened her laptop and accessed the hotel room's camera feed. She had installed a small device on the second day of her stay, a habit she had developed in the Montreal period, and watched the room from the perspective of a pinhole lens concealed in the smoke detector above the desk. 2 men, sitting, one on the desk chair, one on the edge of the bed. Not searching, waiting. Men who had already done their searching and had found what they needed and were now waiting for the person who lived in the room to come back. She watched them for 2 minutes. She did not recognize either of them from her knowledge of Vincent's current operation, which meant either they were new personnel she hadn't mapped or they were not Vincent's people. That second possibility was the one that made her cold in a way the January road had not. She called the only number she had that might answer that question. Cruz picked up, which was the first surprise because Cruz had gone silent after his conversation with Vincent, and she had written him off as a burned contact. "You should leave the city," Cruz said, before she could speak. "Who's in my room, Cruz?" A pause. "How do you know about your room?" "Who are they?" Another pause, longer, the kind that meant he was deciding how much to say and why. "They're not Vincent's," he said finally. "That's all I know." "That's not all you know." "Elena." He used her name. Not Claire. Her name. Which meant whatever he knew, he had known who she was for longer than she had believed. "There's a third party. There has been since the beginning. Someone who knew you were coming back before you got here." The car moved through evening traffic, and she sat in the back of it and felt the shape of what he had just said settle into her understanding like a key finding a lock it wasn't supposed to fit. "Who knew I was coming back?" she said. "I don't know who they are. I know they reached out to Vincent 2 weeks before you made contact with Danny. They told him someone was going to approach his organization using his wife as a weapon. They told him to let it play out because they had their own use for you." "Their own use?" "They wanted you to finish the documentation, the ownership files, the transfer logs. They've been waiting for you to build the package. They don't want Vincent's empire. They want what you were going to hand to the review commission, because what you built points to more than Vincent. It points to the people above Vincent, the people who funded the original consolidation, the people whose names are on none of the public documents but are in the transfer log from 2019. She was quiet. The log you just pulled out of his archive room, Cruz said, which they were watching you pull, which is why there are 2 men in your hotel room right now, because they don't need you to hand it to the commission. They need you to hand it to them. She looked out the car window at the city moving past, the lights of the West Loop smearing in the glass, and she thought about the 2 pieces of luck she had noted and refused to trust: the unlocked loading dock, the malfunctioning stairwell door. And she understood now that they had not been luck. They had been open doors. Someone had opened them for her, specifically tonight, so that she would walk through them and find what she was looking for and emerge from the building with the document that they had been waiting for her to obtain, because she could obtain it in a way they could not. Because she was Vincent's wife, and she had built a network inside his organization, and she had a mind that understood the archive's structure, and they had spent 3 years watching her build herself into exactly the tool they needed. She had not been running a plan. She had been running someone else's plan, and believing it was hers. The cold that moved through her then was not the cold of the January road. That cold had been clean, elemental, honest, a thing that told the truth about what it was. This cold was different. This was the cold of understanding that the autonomy she had built her entire reconstruction on, the fierce and private conviction that she was the one in control, that she had spent 3 years becoming the architect of her own revenge, was built on a foundation she hadn't known was there, laid by hands she hadn't seen, in service of a purpose she had never been told. She had the log. The log was the most dangerous thing in Chicago tonight, and she was holding it, alone, in the back of a car, with 2 men in her hotel room and a third party she couldn't name, and Vincent Moretti somewhere in the city who now knew her face and her name, and that she had just broken into his archive. She had no safe house, no backup contact. Danny was in Portland. Teresa was compromised. Cruz was on the phone telling her things he should have told her weeks ago, which meant Cruz was still playing an angle she couldn't fully see. She was exposed on every side. And the document on her phone, 47 pages of transfer records that detailed the financial architecture of Vincent's consolidation and pointed, according to Cruz, to names that existed nowhere in the public record, was the only thing any of the parties converging on her tonight actually wanted. "Cruz," she said, "are you with them? Or are you telling me this because you want something?" A long pause. "I'm telling you because Vincent is going to move on you tonight, and the people in your hotel room are going to move on you tonight, and you're the only person in this situation who doesn't know the whole board," he said. "What you do with it is your business." "And what do you want for it?" "I want out," he said. "Same as Danny. I want the thing you promised people who helped you, which is a way out of this organization before it finishes collapsing." A breath. "I want you to survive long enough to give it to me." She ended the call. She sat for 30 seconds in the back of the moving car, with the city around her and the document on her phone, and the full weight of the night pressing in from every direction. And she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 3 years of careful, controlled, forward-only motion. She felt afraid. Not the managed fear of the hotel corridor, not the assessed fear of the woman who counted seconds and took inventory and kept walking. The older fear. The fear she had felt in the SUV before Vincent pushed the door open, when she understood what was happening and understood she had no power to stop it. She let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she looked at the driver's partition and said, "Change of destination," and gave him an address that was not a hotel and not a safe house, but was the one place in Chicago where she still had any leverage at all. Because if Cruz was right about the third party, and if the third party had been managing her movements for 3 years, then the only way out of this night was to stop being the person they had been managing and become someone they had not planned for. She had done that once before. She had done it on a road in January, in the snow, with nothing. She had the log. She had her mind. She had the knowledge of who she was and what she had built, and the specific, undefeatable clarity of a woman who had already survived the worst thing anyone had done to her. Whatever came next, she was not going to let it be done to her. She was going to do it. The address she gave the driver was Vincent's. Not the house on Waveland. That was gone. Sold during the federal investigation's asset review, a casualty of the compliance pressure she had applied through channels that felt in retrospect, like the opening moves of a game she had not known she was playing for someone else. The address was a building in River North that officially belonged to a holding company called Lakeview Capital Partners, and that housed, on its third floor, the private office where Vincent conducted the business that did not occur in restaurants or on phones, the room where decisions were made and where the people who needed to be in the room were brought, which meant it was the room where he would be tonight, because tonight was the kind of night that required that room. She knew about the building because Danny had told her about it in their second conversation at Hendricks, mentioning it as the place where the Saturday meeting was being held, the place where Vincent had called his department heads to discuss the containment strategy. She had noted it. She had not planned to go there. She had planned to remain on the perimeter of Vincent's physical world, operating through systems and documents and the financial architecture that didn't require her to be in the same room as the man who had left her to freeze. Plans had a way of not surviving contact with the full truth of a situation. She paid the driver in cash 3 blocks from the building and walked the rest of the way with her bag over one shoulder and the phone in her coat pocket, and the cold of the November night doing nothing to her because she was already operating at a temperature beyond what the weather could affect. The street was quiet, late enough that the restaurant traffic had thinned, early enough that the bars hadn't emptied. A normal Friday night in a neighborhood that didn't know it was the center of anything. She stood across from the building for 2 minutes. 3rd floor. 2 windows lit. The rest of the building dark. She crossed the street and went in through the lobby. The lobby guard was a man she didn't recognize, which meant he was not one of Vincent's regular personnel. A contract hire, probably, brought in because the regular security infrastructure was occupied elsewhere tonight. He looked up when she came in, and she gave him the look she had learned in the first year of her marriage to give to people in positions like his, a look that communicated belonging so completely that challenging it would require more confidence than most people in those positions had been given permission to exercise. "Lakeview, 3rd floor," she said. "I'm expected." He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he went back to his phone. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor. The hallway was carpeted and dim, the kind of corporate anonymous space that could have been any professional office in any building in any city, and for a moment she stood in it and felt the specific unreality of being here, of the distance between the woman she had been the last time she was in a room with Vincent Moretti and the woman standing in this hallway now, with 47 scanned pages on her phone and the knowledge that she had been used and the decision made in the back of a car 12 minutes ago to use that knowledge as a weapon rather than a wound. She heard voices through the door at the end of the hall. Vincent's voice. She would have known it in any acoustic environment, the particular timbre of it, the way it moved through space with the authority of someone who had never needed to raise it to be heard. And another voice, one she didn't recognize, lower, more clipped, with the quality of someone giving information rather than receiving it. She put her hand on the door handle. She opened the door. There were 4 people in the room. Vincent stood at the far end of a long conference table, his back partially to the door, in the posture she remembered, shoulders back, weight slightly forward, the posture of a man who is accustomed to being the heaviest presence in any space. He turned when the door opened. The man she didn't recognize was seated at the table, mid-50s, gray suit, the compact, unremarkable build of someone whose professional value was not physical. He had a laptop open in front of him and a coffee cup that still had steam rising from it, and the expression of a man who processed surprises by going very still. The other 2 were men she did recognize from the organization. Garrett, who had been Vincent's head of security for 3 years, a large, deliberate man with close-cropped hair and the habit of keeping his hands visible at all times. And a woman named Sandra, who ran legal affairs for Meridian Urban Partners, and who Elena had always assessed as the sharpest person in Vincent's operational circle. Sandra was the first to speak. "Elena," she said. Not Claire. Elena. Her voice was completely flat. Vincent had not moved since he turned. He stood at the end of the table and looked at her with an expression that she had prepared herself for, and that still, when she saw it, required a specific internal adjustment, because it was not the expression of a man confronting a threat. It was the expression of a man confronting something he had not entirely believed was real until this moment. He looked at her the way you look at something you thought you had buried. "You should sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." Elena, you left me on a road in January in 0-degree weather, she said. Her voice came out even, which was what she had trained it to do, though the effort it cost her in this room, looking at his face, was larger than she had anticipated. You told me there was a town 12 miles east. There wasn't. There was a cabin I found by accident that had a rusted padlock I knocked off with a rock. I built a fire with matches I found in a tin and slept on a plank floor. Then I walked 4.5 hours through 18 inches of snow in dress boots. She looked at him steadily. I'm fine standing. The room was very quiet. The gray-suited man had not moved. Garrett's hands were visible on the table. Sandra was watching Elena with the focused attention of someone recalculating. Vincent said, "Sit down, Elena." "Who is he?" She gestured at the gray-suited man. Vincent didn't look at him. "His name is Aldrich." "And who does Aldrich work for?" "He works for the people who funded the 2019 consolidation." She had known it before he said it, had arrived at it in the car, but hearing it spoken aloud in a room with Aldrich sitting 3 feet from her with his laptop and his coffee was different from knowing it. It gave the shape of the thing a weight it hadn't had before. "So he's the third party," she said. "He's the representative of the third party," Aldrich said. His voice was precise and lightly accented in a way she couldn't place. "There's a distinction." "I don't care about the distinction," Elena said. "I care about how long you've been managing my movements." "We haven't been managing your movements," Aldrich said. "We've been watching them. There's a distinction there, too." "The loading dock tonight. A coincidence." "Don't," she said. The word came out harder than the others, the first place where the evenness slipped, and she let it stay slipped because this was not a conversation where evenness served her as well as truth. "Don't tell me that was a coincidence. You opened the building for me because you needed me to get the log without leaving an official trace. If I had gone to the commission directly, you would have had to move on the documentation formally, which would have created a record that pointed back to you. But if I obtained it and then you obtained it from me, the chain of custody is broken and your exposure is 0. She looked at Aldrich steadily. "That's the play. That's what you've been waiting for." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're very good." "I'm aware of what I am," she said. "What I want to know is whether Vincent knew." She looked at Vincent when she said it. Vincent met her eyes, and in the 3 seconds of looking that followed, she read his face with the fluency of 5 years of intimate study, and what she read there was not the blankness of the SUV. It was something more complicated, something that had the texture of a man who had been outmaneuvered and knew it, and was deciding how to position himself relative to that knowledge. "He knew Aldrich existed," Elena said, hearing it in his face before he could control it. "He knew someone above him had an interest in what I was doing. He didn't know you were using me to get to them." She turned back to Aldrich. "He thought you were going to help him contain me." "That was one of several possible outcomes," Aldrich said. "Give me the phone," Vincent said. She looked at him. "The log," he said. "Give me the phone, Elena. We can still resolve this without..." "Without what?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she didn't correct it because there was something true in the crack that she had been suppressing since the car, and that needed to be in this room. "Without me having any control over what happens? Without me being the tool that everyone in this situation uses to get what they want and then discards?" She looked at him and felt the old love and the old anger and the thing beyond anger that had no name colliding in her chest all at once. "You already tried that. You tried it on a road in January. It didn't work then." "Elena," his voice dropped. The timbre of it changed, not the authoritative flat voice, something older, something from the register he used in the house on Waveland when it was late and they were alone and the public face had come off. She had not heard that register in 3 years, and it hit her with a force she had not prepared for. "Whatever you think happened. I didn't know they were going to use you. I didn't know Aldrich had been watching you build. I thought..." "You thought I was dead," she said, "or close enough that it didn't matter." He was quiet. "Say it," she said. "I thought you were dead." His jaw tightened. "For 8 months I thought you were dead. Then the account started moving and I understood you weren't, and by then it was..." He stopped. "Was complicated." "It was complicated," she repeated. You left your wife to die in a snowstorm, and when she turned out to be alive and dismantling your organization, it was complicated. Garrett shifted in his chair. Sandra had not moved, was watching the exchange with the expression of someone watching a building decide which direction to fall. Aldrich said, "This is genuinely fascinating, but I need the log by midnight." "You're not getting the log," Elena said. The room changed when she said it. Not loudly. She said it in the same register as everything else. But the change in the room was immediate and physical, the way temperature changes in an enclosed space when a window breaks. Aldrich set his coffee cup down very carefully. "That's not one of the available outcomes." "I know what outcomes you've designed," Elena said. "I've spent 20 minutes understanding the design. You needed the log from Vincent's archive because it contains the transfer records from 2019, and those records document not just Vincent's shell company structure, but the funding source for the consolidation, your clients. The names that appear nowhere in the public documents but are in the log because Marco Bianchi was meticulous and kept source documentation that your clients believed had been destroyed during the federal investigation's compliance review." She watched Aldrich's face as she said this and watched the stillness in it become a different kind of stillness. "You didn't want the log to protect Vincent. You wanted it to protect them, to make sure the ownership review never found documentation that pointed above Vincent's lair. And you used me to get it because I could get it cleanly, and you couldn't." "Give me the phone," Aldrich said. No precision in it now, something harder. "I sent the file 45 minutes ago," Elena said. The silence that followed was absolute. Garrett stood up. Aldrich's hands went flat on the table. Vincent went very still in the way he went still when something happened that required all of his processing, when the surface had to be emptied so the interior could work. "You're lying," Aldrich said. "From the car on the way here," Elena said. Encrypted package to 2 recipients. The Ownership Review Commission and a journalist named Carver at the Tribune business desk, with a note explaining the significance of the 2019 transfer records, and specifically the funding source documentation on pages 31 through 38. She looked at him. "I didn't send it to investigators. I sent it to people who will publish it and file it simultaneously, which means by the time anyone in this room makes a phone call to anyone who could stop it, it's already in official hands and on a newsroom server." Aldrich stood up. He was not a physically imposing man, but standing, he had a quality of concentrated, contained force that she registered and held steady against. "Sit down," said Vincent. Aldrich looked at Vincent. "Sit down," Vincent said again. His voice had the old flat authority in it. Whatever was happening in his interior, the surface was operational. "She's not lying. Look at her. She's not lying." Aldrich sat down. Slowly. With the deliberateness of a man reassessing the entire geometry of a situation he had believed he controlled. Vincent looked at Elena across the table. "You understand what you just did," he said. "I understand exactly what I did. The names in pages 31 through 38 are not the kind of names that respond to press coverage by cooperating with an investigation," he said. "They're the kind of names that respond by removing the source of the problem." "I know." "Elena." He said her name, and it had the weight of the road in January, the weight of 5 years, the weight of everything that had happened since. "You just made yourself the most dangerous person in this room." I've been the most dangerous person in this room since I walked in," she said. "You just didn't know it yet." Garrett's hand moved toward his jacket. "Don't," said Elena. She had her phone in her hand, the screen showing the sent confirmation. "There are 2 people in this city who have been watching my location in real time tonight. If I stop moving for more than 6 minutes, they file a second package to a 3rd recipient. Federal investigators who have been building an independent case on the 2019 consolidation for 2 years, and who would consider the transfer log exactly the kind of primary source documentation that converts a building case into an indictment." She looked at Garrett. "Take your hand away from your jacket." Garrett looked at Vincent. Vincent said, "Take your hand away." Garrett's hand came back to the table. The room breathed. Elena looked at Vincent, really looked at him, the way she had not allowed herself to look at him since she walked through the door, with the full inventory of what she saw, the 3 years written on his face, the stress fractures that matched the ones in his organization, The particular quality of exhaustion that lived in the face of a man who had been fighting a war of attrition for 36 months and had just discovered that the general on the other side was his wife. He looked older. He looked like a man who had been spending himself and had been doing the math on what remained and had not liked the numbers. He looked like a man who had made the worst mistake of his life on a road in January and who was only now, in this room, arriving at the full accounting of what that mistake had cost. "You came here to give me the chance to see it," he said. Not a question. "Yes, you could have sent everything from Portland," he said. "You didn't need to be in this building tonight. You didn't need to be in this room." "No," she said, "I didn't." "Then why?" She looked at him for a long moment. The answer was not simple, and she did not simplify it. "Because I needed to know if you knew," she said, "about Aldrich, about what was being done to me from above. I needed to know if you were complicit in all of it or just the part on the road." His jaw moved. "And now you know." "Now I know." "Does it change anything?" She considered that question with the same honesty she had applied to every question in the preceding 3 years. The honesty that had been the one thing she refused to strip away even when everything else had been stripped, because it was the only tool she trusted completely. "No," she said, "not for the organization, not for the log, not for any of the mechanisms I put in place." She held his gaze. "But it changes what I think of you, slightly, in a direction I didn't expect." Aldrich said, "This is not—" "Be quiet," Elena said. Aldrich was quiet. Vincent looked at her with the face she had read for 5 years, and what she saw in it now was the thing she had wanted to see when she walked through the door. Not defeat, not calculation, not the blankness of the SUV, but the recognition, the full, undefended recognition of what she was, what she had done, what she had built from nothing in the snow, and the understanding that he had made it possible by leaving her there, and that the understanding had arrived too late and at too high a cost to be worth anything except the having of it. "What do you want from me?" he said. The oldest question, the one that came at the end of everything else. She took a breath. "I want you to walk out of this room with me," she said. "I want you to come with me to the commission office, tonight. And I want you to provide voluntary testimony about the 2019 consolidation, not about your operations, not about your people, about the funding source, about the names on pages 31 through 38. She watched his face. "You do that, and you become a witness, not a target. You do that, and Aldrich's clients stop being the people who need you removed and start being the people you've just made more dangerous to protect than to allow to survive." "You're asking me to burn them," Vincent said. "I'm asking you to survive," she said, "which is what you told me I was strong enough to do when you pushed me out of the car. You were right. Turns out you are too." The room was very still. Outside the third-floor windows, Chicago moved through its ordinary Friday night, unaware of the geometry shifting in this room, the weight redistribution, the tectonic adjustment of power between a man who had built an empire and the woman he had left in the snow who had come back as the instrument of its ending. Aldrich said, "Moretti, think carefully." Vincent looked at Aldrich with the expression of a man who has finished thinking and has arrived somewhere clean on the other side of it. Then he looked at Elena, and she held his gaze, and for 3 seconds neither of them said anything. And in those 3 seconds, everything that had happened between them, the road, the cabin, the fire, the 3 years, the log, this room, this night, existed simultaneously in the space between their faces, and there was nothing left to negotiate or obscure or manage. He said, "Let me get my coat." Aldrich's chair scraped back hard against the floor, and his hand went to the inside of his jacket, and Garrett came up out of his chair, and Sandra said something sharp that was lost under the sound of Vincent's voice saying one word, one flat, absolute, utterly authoritative word directed at Garrett. And the room erupted into the specific controlled violence of men who have been waiting for permission and have received it. And Elena stepped back against the wall with her phone in her hand and the sent confirmation on the screen and her heart hitting the inside of her chest with a force she felt in her throat. And she watched the room move around her and kept her eyes on the door and kept her finger on the screen and stayed on her feet, and stayed clear-headed and stayed, above all else, still standing. She had built this moment from a plank floor and a tin of matches and 4.5 hours of snow. She was not going to fall down in it now. Garrett moved first. He came up out of his chair with the weight and momentum of a man who had made this kind of decision before and had learned to commit to it fully, no half measures, no hesitation, the body doing what the body had been trained to do before the mind had finished processing the order. His hand came out of his jacket with a weapon, and he had it leveled at Elena before Vincent had finished saying the word he'd said. The single flat word that was supposed to stop exactly this. It didn't stop Garrett. What stopped Garrett was Sandra. Elena had assessed Sandra correctly over 3 years of second-hand observation, the sharpest person in Vincent's operational circle. But she had assessed her incorrectly in one specific dimension, which was the nature of Sandra's loyalty. She had assumed Sandra's loyalty was to Vincent's organization, to the structure and the income, and the professional position it represented. She had not considered that Sandra's loyalty might be personal, might be the older and more durable kind, the kind that precedes organizational affiliation and survives its dissolution. Sandra picked up Aldrich's coffee cup and put it through the side of Garrett's face with a force and accuracy that suggested it was not the first time she had hit someone with a ceramic object in a small room. The cup didn't break. It connected with the orbital bone above Garrett's right eye, and the impact was immediate and total, his body registering the blow before his mind could compensate. The weapon dropping and his hand going to his face, and 300 pounds of trained security personnel sitting down very suddenly on the floor of the conference room. Aldrich had his hand inside his jacket, but had not completed the draw, and in the half-second of Garrett's collapse, he looked at the room, at Sandra standing with a broken coffee cup handle in her hand, at Vincent 3 feet away with his weight forward and his face absolutely clear of everything except intention, at Elena against the wall with her phone. And he did the calculation that men like Aldrich do when the geometry has shifted past the point where force is the most efficient variable. He took his hand out of his jacket. "Sit down," Vincent said. For the 3rd time tonight, the same word, the same register, but something different underneath it now. Not the authority of a man controlling a room, but the authority of a man who has decided what he is and what he is willing to lose for it, and is operating from that decision cleanly. Aldrich sat down. Garrett was conscious, his hand pressed against his face, blood running through his fingers from a cut above the orbital bone, breathing through his nose in the careful way of someone determining whether something was broken. The room was very still. Elena pushed off the wall and looked at Sandra. Sandra looked back at her with the level, unreadable gaze she had always had in Elena's second-hand picture of her, but there was something in it now that Elena hadn't expected. Not hostility, not calculation, something quieter, more ambiguous. "Why?" Elena said. Sandra set the broken handle on the table. "Because I've worked for this man for 9 years, and I know the difference between a decision made in fear and a decision made in character. Tonight was the first one in a long time." Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded. She looked at Vincent. "Your coat," she said. He got his coat. They left the building at 11:41 in the evening. Vincent and Elena through the front entrance, Sandra 2 steps behind. Aldrich left in the conference room with a specific and non-negotiable instruction from Vincent about what would happen if he made a phone call in the next 90 minutes. Whether Aldrich believed the instruction was a calculation he made for himself. Elena guessed he believed it, because Vincent's voice when he delivered it had the quality that Vincent's voice had when the thing being said was absolutely true. And Aldrich was a man who had survived in his profession by accurately reading the truth content of what powerful people said to him. Garrett. They left on the floor. He was conscious and had his phone, and his medical situation was not life-threatening and was not her problem. The street outside was cold and clear, the kind of November night that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be winter. The air smelled of the lake and of the particular urban cold that Elena associated with Chicago in a way that was inseparable from the city itself. A smell that meant something different to her now than it had 3 years ago. Not home exactly, but the place where the story had happened, where the road had been, where she had walked out of the snow and into whatever she had become. Vincent walked beside her without speaking. He had put on his coat in the elevator and stood in it now the way he stood in everything, with the physical authority of a man accustomed to being the fixed point in any environment. But something in the bearing had changed from the room, some essential quality of the posture that had always communicated unassailability. He looked like a man carrying weight that he had agreed to carry and was not pretending was light. She had called ahead from the building's lobby. There was a car waiting. The Commission's intake office maintained an after-hours emergency contact protocol for exactly the category of material Elena had submitted. Documentation supporting an active ownership review, arriving through a source with direct operational knowledge. She had researched the protocol in Portland 14 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon between reviewing transfer log structures and eating a container of leftover rice because it was the only thing in the apartment. The intake officer who met them was a woman named Patricia Holloway, 47, who had the exhausted but unsurprised quality of a public servant who had been doing this long enough that very little presented itself as genuinely novel. She looked at Elena, looked at Vincent, looked at Sandra, and said, "I've reviewed the initial package. Which one of you has the operational knowledge?" "Both of us," Elena said. "Different layers." Patricia Holloway processed that with a slight compression of her mouth that was not quite a smile. "Come in," she said. What followed was 4 hours. Elena had given testimony before, not to investigators, but in the deposition Vincent's lawyers had required her for during a civil proceeding 3 years before the road, testimony about the Waveland House's ownership structure that she had given carefully and accurately and without volunteering anything she wasn't asked. She knew the mechanics of it. She knew the difference between testimony that served the moment and testimony that served the record. She gave testimony that served the record. She was specific. She was precise. She did not editorialize or contextualize beyond what was asked, because editorializing gave opposing counsel surface area, and she wanted to leave no surface area. She walked Patricia Holloway and the 2 additional intake staff who arrived at 2 in the morning through the account structuring she had performed 6 years ago, through the methodology she had used to identify the shell company vulnerabilities, through the documentation package and its sources, through the specific pages of the transfer log that identified the funding source for the 2019 consolidation. She said Marco Bianchi's name. She said what she had helped him with, and why, and what she had understood at the time, and what she had chosen not to understand. She did not minimize that last part. She said it plainly. She had chosen not to ask questions she knew would have uncomfortable answers, and she had benefited from that choice. And that was a thing that had happened, and that she was accounting for now, because accounting for it was the only honest thing available to her. Patricia Holloway listened to that portion without expression and wrote something on her notepad and moved on. Vincent testified separately, in an adjacent room with Sandra present. Elena did not know the specific content of what he said. She knew the shape of it from understanding what Patricia Holloway needed and what Vincent had that was relevant to that need. The funding source information, the names, the specifics of how the consolidation capital had flowed in and what had been expected in return. He had carried that knowledge for 6 years in the sealed interior of a man who had built his entire operation on never being the weakest point in his own structure. He was being the weakest point now. She thought about what that cost him, and she didn't look away from the thinking. At 4:47 in the morning, Patricia Holloway came back to Elena's room and set a piece of paper on the table and said, "Preliminary cooperation agreement. Your attorney should review it before you sign, but the structure is full immunity for the account structuring assistance in 2019, conditional on the completeness and accuracy of tonight's testimony and any follow-up requests in the next 18 months. Elena looked at the paper. "And Vincent?" "Mr. Moretti's agreement is separate. That's between him and his counsel." "I know. I'm asking if there is one." Patricia Holloway looked at her for a moment. "There are significant operational disclosures he's able to provide that have value to active investigations beyond this review. There will likely be an agreement. It will have conditions." She paused. "The conditions won't be comfortable." Elena nodded. "No, I don't imagine they will be." She looked at the paper on the table and thought about the road, and thought about the fire, and thought about the 3 years and the Montreal apartment and the laptop and the cold, and the specific quality of will that had been required to keep the mechanism running on the days when it had felt less like purpose and more like the simple refusal to be the version of herself that Vincent had expected her to remain. Diminished, gone, erased. She thought about Sylvia, who had made the wrong calculation and would face the consequences of it. She thought about Danny in Portland, who had made the right one and had received what she'd promised him. She thought about Cruz, whose motivations she had never fully untangled, and who had, in the end, told her something true when he could have kept it from her, and for whom she would find a way to account when the accounting was possible. She thought about Sandra, who was in the next room with a man she had worked for 9 years, helping him do the hardest thing he had ever done, which was not the hardest thing because it was dangerous, but because it required him to become smaller in the eyes of the world he had constructed himself to dominate. She picked up the pen. She signed the paper. They came out of the commission building at 5:53 in the morning into a Chicago that was beginning the specific gray transition from night to pre-dawn, the sky above the lake showing the first diluted lightning that was not yet color, just the absence of absolute dark. Vincent was already outside. He was standing on the steps with his hands in his coat pockets and his breath making brief white shapes in the cold air, and he looked like what he was. A man at the end of something, standing in the early morning of the day when everything he had built was in other people's hands, and the only direction available was forward into whatever the consequence was. Elena stopped beside him. They stood for a moment without speaking. The city made its early sounds, a distant truck, a light cycling through green to yellow to red on an empty intersection, the wind coming off the lake with the clean, indifferent persistence of things that are not concerned with human chronology. "Sandra's getting a car," Vincent said. "I know." He looked out at the street. "The River North apartment. That was you." "Yes." "The Tribune piece?" "Yes." "The banking holds?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The planning department filing?" "Yes." He exhaled through his nose. Not a laugh, not exactly. Something with the shape of a laugh, but none of its warmth. "You built all of it," he said. "The whole architecture." "I had good material to work from," she said. "You gave me 5 years of education. I gave you a death sentence." "That too." He turned and looked at her, and in the early morning light his face was neither the face from the SUV nor the face from the conference room, but something third and more honest. The face of a man who has been stripped of the persona he built and is standing in what's underneath it, which is almost always more human and more diminished and more real than the persona was. "I was afraid," he said. She looked at him. "That night, I was afraid of the investigation, afraid of what Marco had said, afraid that you were the variable I couldn't manage, and fear made me into something He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't have a version of that sentence that ends in a way that's worth saying." "No," she agreed. "You don't. I know that." She looked at him for a long moment, with all of it present between them. The road, the fire, the years, the room, this morning. And she felt the full weight of it, and did not ask it to be lighter than it was, because asking it to be lighter would be dishonest, and dishonesty was the thing she had given up in a cabin in the woods when she was trying to stay alive, and only honesty had anything useful to say. "You were the only person who ever believed I was more than what the organization needed me to be," he said. "I knew that. I knew it, and I made the decision anyway." "I know," she said. "Does that matter to you?" She thought about it with the same seriousness she had given to every question worth taking seriously. "It matters that you know it," she said. "Whether it matters to me in the way you're asking, no, not anymore. That part of what it could matter is 3 years and a road away." She looked at him steadily. "But I don't hate you. I want you to know that. Not because you deserve not to be hated. Because I made a decision 3 years ago in a snowstorm that I was going to spend my energy on building rather than burning, and hating you is burning." He looked at her for a long time. "That's more than I gave you," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Sandra's car appeared at the curb, She came out through the commission building's doors and looked at both of them with the careful neutrality of someone who understands that they are standing adjacent to the conclusion of something that does not require their comment. Vincent looked at Elena one last time. The look had the quality of a period at the end of a very long sentence. Not resolution exactly, not peace exactly, but completion. The specific closing that happens when a thing is finished and both people know it and there is nothing left to negotiate. "Where will you go?" he said. "Away," she said. "And then somewhere." He nodded. He walked down the steps to the car. He stopped with his hand on the door and didn't turn around and said, without looking at her, "You were always the strongest thing in my organization. I just didn't have the sense to say it while it would have meant something." Elena stood on the steps of the commission building in the early morning of a Chicago November and watched him get in the car, and she felt what she felt, which was complicated and real, and hers, and she did not perform any version of it for anyone because there was no one watching, and she had stopped performing things when she built a fire on a plank floor in the middle of a January snowstorm and understood that no one was coming to be an audience for her survival. The car pulled away. She stood on the steps until it was gone. Three months later, the beneficial ownership review of Vincent Moretti's real estate portfolio resulted in the forced divestiture of 11 of the 14 flagged properties. The proceeds were placed in a court-supervised trust pending resolution of related civil proceedings. Two banks terminated their credit relationships with Meridian Urban Partners. The Tribune ran a four-part series. The names on pages 31 through 38 of the transfer log became the subject of a federal investigation that operated quietly and with the particular patience of institutional processes that do not need to hurry because the documentation is complete and the outcome is not in doubt. Aldrich left the country 6 weeks after the commission filing, which was 3 weeks before a federal grand jury issued a sealed indictment for a name that appeared on those pages. Whether Aldrich had adequate warning from adequate sources was a question that the investigation was still working toward answering. Vincent Moretti entered a formal cooperation agreement with two overlapping investigations and relocated, under conditions he did not choose and could not modify, to a city that was not Chicago. The agreement's conditions were not comfortable, as Patricia Holloway had said they would not be. He met them. Sandra went with him because that was her choice, and she made it. Marco Bianchi's careful record-keeping, the archived log that his meticulous, old-fashioned insistence on paper documentation had preserved through a federal investigation that should have destroyed it, turned out to be the most consequential thing he had ever done. He had been, in the end, the honest accountant in a dishonest organization, and his honesty, filtered through Elena's 3 years of patient construction, had become the instrument of that organization's accounting. Elena thought about that sometimes, the irony of it. She thought about Marco without resentment. He had given her name to federal investigators out of fear, and fear was something she understood now at a depth she hadn't when she married into the world that had produced him, and understanding at that depth didn't leave much room for resentment. She went to Portland first because she had told Danny she would, and she kept the commitments she made. She spent 4 days there, settling the financial arrangement she had promised him, and on the last evening she sat across from him in a bar that was nothing like Hendrick's, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been through something and survived it and is still processing the survival. "You actually did it," he said. "Yes." "I didn't think—" He stopped. "I believed in what you were doing. I just didn't think one person could actually—" "It wasn't one person," she said. "It was a lot of people making choices. You, Sandra, Cruz, Teresa, until she wasn't." She looked at her glass. "Choices compound. That's the thing nobody tells you. Every choice compounds." "What are you going to do now?" She thought about it. "Something that uses the same skills in a different direction," she said. "There are a lot of organizations with stress fractures in their financial architecture. Most of them aren't criminal. Most of them just have problems they can't see from the inside because they're too close to the structure." She looked at him. "Turns out I'm good at seeing from the outside." Danny nodded slowly. He looked at his drink and then at her. "Was it worth it?" "All of it. 3 years. She held the question the way she held every question she took seriously, fully, without deflecting toward the easier answer. "I'm alive," she said. "I'm free. I know what I'm made of." She paused. "Ask me in 5 years whether it was worth it. Right now I'm still too close to the structure." He laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and surprised, and it loosened something in the atmosphere of the bar that had needed loosening. She left Portland the next morning. She ended up in a city on the West Coast that had the particular quality of cities that are always becoming something, restless, layered, full of people who had arrived from somewhere else and were constructing their next version of themselves from the materials available. She had been in cities like this before, in the 3 years passing through. She had not let herself stay anywhere long enough to call it arriving. She arrived. She rented an apartment on the 4th floor of a building that had 2 exits and a window with a view of the street, but she chose it for the light. Afternoon light that came in at an angle that made the whole space warm in a way she had not had in any apartment in 3 years. The warm and indifferent light of a place that didn't know her history and didn't care. She set up the laptop and the encrypted drive and the monitoring systems that she could not yet bring herself to dismantle entirely, because 3 years of architecture didn't come apart overnight, and she was not going to pretend it did. She put her books on the shelves. She bought a plant, the kind of plant that could survive periodic neglect, because she knew herself well enough to know that her attention would sometimes go elsewhere. On the 4th day, she opened the laptop and drafted the first message to the first client of the firm she was establishing, a legitimate financial consulting practice, structured under her own name, Elena Voss, not Claire Ashworth, not Elena Moretti, the name she had been born with and had not used professionally in 6 years. The practice would specialize in organizational financial structure analysis, identifying systemic vulnerabilities in institutional balance sheets before those vulnerabilities became crises. She was very good at identifying vulnerabilities in institutional balance sheets. She had demonstrated that across 3 years and 14 shell companies and a 4-story office building at 11 at night with a portable document scanner. She sent the message. She closed the laptop. She made coffee and took it to the window and stood in the afternoon light with the cup warm in both hands and the city below her doing what cities do. Moving, accumulating, generating the ordinary noise of many people pursuing many purposes that were mostly unrelated to each other and occasionally, briefly, intersecting. She thought about the road. She thought about it the way she had trained herself to think about it, not as the worst thing, not as the pivot of her story, but as the beginning of a sequence, a door, the kind that only opens from one side and that the person going through it believes is a wall until they're on the other side of it. She thought about the tin of matches, the 4 attempts, the dropped match, the fire that caught on the 5th try and held. She thought about the moment she had stopped counting her heartbeats and started counting her steps east along the road, and how that shift, from monitoring her own fear to simply moving through it, had been the practical beginning of everything that followed. She did not think about it as triumph. Triumph was a word for moments, and this was not a moment. This was the territory after the moments, the long, flat ground that you only reach if you stay alive through the peaks, and the ground was ordinary and quiet and entirely hers. She finished the coffee. She washed the cup and set it on the drying rack and thought about what she would make for dinner. A thought so small and so domestic and so entirely unconnected to any of the machinery of the preceding 3 years that it surprised her by making her eyes sting briefly at the corners, which she noted with the same directness she had learned to apply to everything. She was allowed to be tired. She had earned tired. She was allowed to want ordinary things. Dinner, afternoon light, a plant that survived occasional neglect. She had built herself in a snowstorm from the raw material of what betrayal had left her with, which had turned out to be more than anyone, including herself, had believed. She had done what she said she would do. She had not done it cleanly or without cost. Nothing that matters is done cleanly or without cost, and she had stopped expecting otherwise somewhere in the 2nd year when the loneliness of the construction had been at its most absolute. But she had done it. Vincent Moretti had left his wife in the snow, and the snow had made her into something he had no framework for, because he had never understood that the quality he most consistently underestimated in her was not her intelligence or her capability or her discipline. It was her willingness to look at the truth of a situation and not flinch. He had done her the accidental service of creating the conditions in which that quality, stripped of everything that had been cushioning it, had nothing to do but become its fullest version. She was grateful for nothing that he had done, but she was clear-eyed about what it had produced. The afternoon light moved across the floor of the apartment, and she watched it move, and the city outside went on being the city. And Elena Voss stood in her own kitchen in the ordinary hour of an ordinary afternoon and was, for the first time in as long as she could accurately remember, entirely and uncomplicatedly present in her own life. Not surviving it, living it. That was enough. That was in the end the only thing that had ever actually been the point. The story was finished. Every betrayal answered, every debt settled, every door that needed to be closed, closed, not with violence or ceremony, but with the quiet, irrevocable finality of a woman who had decided on a January road in 0-degree weather with nothing but a coat and $400 and the architecture of her own mind, that she was going to live, and had proceeded to do exactly that, and had arrived here, in this light, in this city, with this cup of coffee and this view and this silence that was not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion. She was done. She was free. She was home.